All right, folks, welcome to Lead Generation Week. My name is Michael Faree. We've got our last session of day number 4 on the deck here. Before we get started, I do want to mention all of the things I mentioned before every session, which is would love for you to participate, ask as many questions as you would like. It's real simple. You can ask them in the app that you're using right now to watch this. There's a session Q&A area to the right of the screen there. Just type them in there. I'll see them and get them over to our presenter today. Or you can use the Zoom. There's actually, if you see, there's a little Q&A icon on the video screen. You can use that as well, and that goes right in to Zoom, and we'll see it there as well. But definitely ask questions. Like I said, that's the best way to get a lot of great information out of our experts that are here is by asking any and all questions. So please do that. So without any further ado, I want to bring on our speaker today. We're going to, the session today is Grow Your Business with Podcasts, which I think is extremely timely in today's world. I mean, heck, we at Lead Generation World obviously do podcasts. I don't know if it helps grow our business. Maybe we're not doing it right, but we'll learn a little bit about that here today with our speaker, Kenneth Kinney, which is the Chief Shark Officer of his podcast, A Shark's Perspective, which is awesome, with over, and he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but over 250, are we maybe even at the 300 mark with podcasts, so certainly an expert. And also works with AI Media Group as their director of digital strategy. So, Kenneth, I'm going to hand it over to you, and maybe you can clean up any errors I just had in that.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I appreciate it, Mike. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to do this and be on the show. So a little bit about me. Let me grab my share screen button. Bear with me here. So I have been working in radio and TV for a lot of years. Started out in radio 100 years ago and had a radio show, went back to radio about a decade ago and was doing a radio and TV show locally here. And then did it for years and turned it into a podcast as well. But what I did a couple of years ago when I wanted to brush back off those skills was I wanted to jump in full in and do it all over. But I was working a daytime job and really wanted to start working on my own personal brand and building that back out. I had developed a pretty significant following when I was on local TV and radio, but did not want to go into the station at certain time every week and try to get the guests that I knew. It was just really hard to do. So podcasting, which I'd already played with quite a lot, was really starting to blossom pretty thoroughly a few years ago. And I'm now at roughly show 228, I believe. And my show is called A Shark's Perspective. My daytime job, I work as VP of Marketing and Digital Strategy for AI Media Group, which is a fantastic performance marketing agency in New York. And my show that I do on the side is called The Shark's Perspective. My nickname is Shark. You will notice a lot of shark paraphernalia behind me when I pull that off the screen, and I swim with sharks pretty regularly, at least when we're able to travel. But we'll dive in a little bit as to why I metaphorically use me as a big fat great white shark. So but in marketing today, especially in lead gen, it's one of my favorite slides I use all the time that I created. It's, half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is I don't know which half. Well, that's especially true today because so many people, this is John Wanamaker, the famed marketing pioneer from 100 years ago, who asked this question. Podcasting is really going through the roof. When I presented at Lead Generation World back in January, there was on record about 800,000 podcasts. During this, COVID mess that we're going through, now we're at close to 1 million podcasts. However, just as serious coming out of this and any efforts you take going forward, it's really figuring out, is this performing? I mean, most of us are in the performance marketing and lead generation space. So we really understand the value of figuring out, not just doing something for a wasted effort that a lot of people traditionally have done. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that go into podcasting and some of the questions. So today, your listing competition is your brand's competitors. And that's a big fat false. It's a perfect example. When you think of all the podcasts that are out there, one of the biggest things, and stop share. Okay, there we go. So one of the biggest things to think about, and the reason why I use Joe Rogan's picture in particular, is that your brand, if you're an accounting firm, if you're a solar panel company, if you're a termite pest control, anything you do, understand that the listenership is not tuning in just so they can hear what Nike has to say every day about shoes. They're not generally listening to everything in your thought leadership only about termite control or solar panels. They need to be infotained. So if you think of the kind of content you're producing, it's a different medium than necessarily going to a website and looking at people that are reading blog posts and answering questions and dialogues and posting on social. This is more of a different kind of medium that a lot of people experience. So you're competing against infotaining shows, and that's really a key point. I won't spend too much time on content, but what a lot of people often lose is that they don't focus enough on the value of their content. They just jump in, and then it sounds like, two old guys talking about routers, and that's never an interesting show. But what's really exciting about podcasting and where it's going today is where we're able to take it a lot, like we're doing with digital and with connected TV, is there's a lot more attribution behind this. It's still a pretty murky place, but you're able to position it in a much different way than you could have before. So another question is, who will listen? One of the biggest things I always encourage people to do is to really focus on, when you're developing that audience, targeting your message and knowing who you're targeting. For a lot of people, they just think that they can put out any kind of content whatsoever and just think that people are going to listen. But we hear this over and over. People are not waking up in the morning, for example, jumping on Facebook and saying, what does Domino's Pizza have to tell me about the world? I mean, you've got to create the kind of content that people want to listen to, especially if you think about on their commute. If they're commuting to work, back when we used to do that regularly, when people were commuting to work and listenership was really up, is this the kind of thing that you're going to want to listen to in the car, on a train, whatever it is, and really help you fix your problem for your customers, whatever it is you're doing? Or if you're a customer, is the solution that you're listening to going to help you listen and understand what that problem is that needs to be fixed? So one of the real things that you have to think of early is think about the hook, from the show's perspective, and to what is the real value in listening to this kind of podcast? What is that value to them in order to listen? Now, I will tell you that podcast listening is way down for a lot of people across the board. I mean, if you're talking about Clorox wipes and Lysol and other ways to protect yourself during the pandemic and come out of it, that's a different listenership. But if you think about the normal listenership for most podcasts, they're down. However, I mentioned Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan just signed a $100 million deal with Spotify. So, I mean, it shows you where the value is in this. But you've really got to think about the target audience that your customers are looking for today. And I often kind of equate this to, who is the smart advertiser that's spending money on paid search today? A lot of people can't afford to do it. But when you think of the value that people get knowing where your ads are when they are searching, I kind of tend to think of it a little bit like that. So you've got to be out there with advertising so that people can understand where to find your product when they are searching for it. Now, another really important piece I love to discuss always in this production, I apologize, the exact same time that we're doing this, my neighbor decided to get his yard mowed with a commercial mower service. So if you hear that, I apologize. But your podcasting strategy should also really unpack great stories. This is critical for anybody to be able to tell a great story, whether you're on your own show or on somebody else's show. But to Michael's point, one other thing to really think about in your strategy before we dive into a few other tactics is start really thinking about do you, this community that you're building, for example, Mike's show, the Lead Generation World show, I mean, he's really building a community that keeps these thought leaders that come back to listen to his show over and over for great lead gen tactics. And it also is a great, lead gen tool to get people who are interested in going to Lead Gen World. So it's, when you think about building that community, I mean, Lead Generation World and what some of the other conferences and people do, that's what they're building. I focus a lot on lead gen, all types of performance marketing, advertising, a lot of things like that. What generally you need to do to make a business grow and be successful. So that's really where a lot of mine goes. But another thing to think about that so many people today think about and ask this question is, do you have to start your own podcast? So, you remember when I mentioned how many shows that there were and how many episodes there are out there? Well, before you leap into that kind of commitment with your own show, for all those I sort of use naughty by nature fans, consider leveraging OPP. And what I mean by that is other people's platforms. There's a lot of benefit to not only hosting your own show, but there's a huge SEO benefit. And I know a lot of people who've built businesses being on other people's shows. So when you think about that choice, really from a lead gen perspective, think, do you need to own it as the expert, having guests come on or experts for your company come on? Or is there a value? This is a primary choice. Is there a value for you as the expert? Maybe you're the engineer or the CEO, or you've got a product or service that you're mentioning, and what value you get on being on other people's show. That SEO choice alone is really a key differentiator to help figure out whether or not you should move towards one path or another. But like a lot of other forms of content, it's not just against your vertical. Again, it's against the Joe Rogan type shows of the world and all those others. It's ones like mine that talk about, silly things like sharks and MMA half the time when I'm talking about everything else. But I love using the slide all the time. Jeff Goldblum said it best in Jurassic Park, yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should. So I always encourage people really to look before you leap. You really owe it to your own audience and your own fans. Another part of that is that so many shows die off within 7 episodes. That's generally the number we've heard for quite some time now, that there are 1 million shows, but a lot of those shows will die off. I think a lot of those shows will also die off once the hobby starts to interfere with everybody getting back to work. However, there will be some adoption period for a lot of those people to get ingrained back in, but you don't necessarily have to create your own show to get a good value and a good SEO value out there. I find often that there are a lot of shows that are, especially evergreen shows, that can be posted a year ago. And if you find your name or your link or whatever, your company's link on another website, that gets a fair amount of traffic, even if the show's a year old. There's a huge value to that. So often look at really the first choice as kind of a Morpheus from the Matrix choice. It becomes the red pill or the blue pill with figuring out what you want to do. Then I really jump into looking at, if you host your own podcast, is it a great place to sell? Traditionally, it sort of reminds me a little bit of Twitter. It's not a great place to sell in that people don't want to listen to your ads over and over and over. It is more of a soft direct response than a heavy direct response. And it takes a lot of people a hard amount of time to figure that out. And that's why a lot of those shows then become unsuccessful, and that's why they often die off. So keep that in mind pretty substantially. You do know, though, that with a lot of content marketing efforts, so this is something that can really help bring people in, because we know that listeners who've purchased an item after hearing a sponsored ad is way up. So I always tell people to stop, and I would suggest, if you're going to have an ad, not to overly direct sell your product or your service in your own podcast. You can run an ad, that says brought to you by. That's typically what happens. But it's kind of like Twitter. You don't buy a lot of things, most people don't, off Twitter, but they may jump in and then eventually get to a link somewhere that takes them somewhere to grab it. But it's not necessarily known as the best social sales channel. So find out more at the first or the end, or however you want to do it, as a mid-roll type ad. But a lot of people really detest ads on podcasts and overselling on them. So you just have to be really careful of how you do that and how you fit it into your show. most importantly, you got to think about how it helps your customers fix their problems. If you have to run an ad though, just because it's in your nature, then consider at least running it through a podcast advertising network where your ad may be featured on another show, something that necessarily really complements your vertical on someone else's show, something with a hint on your own show or on someone else's show. But it doesn't need to remind them 20 times, within a half-hour show that this was brought to you by, XYZ company. But remember that people don't wake up in the morning and they typically are not dying to hear what you're saying about your brand or what somebody else is saying, what Allstate's saying about insurance. That's not what we wake up. If anything, we're waking up to watch a local news show talk about the weather, not necessarily for the local news show to tell us what their brand is and how great they are over and over. Just an example. But there are great ways to tell amazing stories without necessarily doing too heavy a direct response push. And that can lead to a higher amount of lead generation. Now, I mentioned podcast advertising. Podcast advertising revenue was forecasted to exceed $1 billion by 2021. Now, I don't know, and no one knows how exactly that's going to pivot, but I will give you a couple of pointers. And I presented this slide earlier back in January when I was at Lead Generation World. So listenership is down. And so a lot of those numbers, when podcast advertisers are looking to advertise and they're asking about what your reach is and everything else, they know it's down. But what's also interesting to me is that so many places that are not doing, for example, a lot of sponsors, a lot of vendors are not presenting right now at great conferences across the country. They need to put those dollars somewhere. There are, a ton of good businesses out there that do this. They need dollars they need to place some ad dollars somewhere. The number of calls, the number of emails that I get now on a regular basis has spiked substantially because of the success of my own show. And so it's very interesting and entertaining to see that while the listenership has fallen a bit, the amount of requests that I've held off to date on, at least, posting ads on in some form or fashion. I've used other forms of attribution, but there are different ways to really, keep that in mind. So I'm going to pull up a slide here. Bear with me 2 seconds. My apologies. I have ADHD, so I'm going to tend to look over at the, I'm going to look over at the guy on the lawnmower too. So I'm going to skip presenting here a second. So here we go. One example that I really love is On Life and Land. Now, I'm not a tractor buyer, but this is a podcast that was put out by John Deere. This is not anything that was necessarily, you got to go buy a tractor, you got to go buy a tractor, you got to go buy a tractor. This is not those kind of ads. What they typically did in their show is they talked about farm life, farmer's life, all the things that farmers, people that would typically buy tractors would understand and appreciate. And it was a brilliantly successful show for them. They talked about normal things like depression that you could put on any show. And it was really well done and focused on their target audience and the kind of messaging that they wanted to hear. It wasn't a place to just say, here's 10% off, buy a tractor today. Another example is a friend of mine who produces, AARP's The Perfect Scam, where he just left there as the producer. But The Perfect Scam is a show that, and he was on a previous episode and he got me to listen to it. And then I was targeted 1,000 times, even though I hadn't hit the 50 mark by AARP, but it was a great example of where retargeting works. But The Perfect Scam was a show put on by AARP. It's still on now. It's got a new co-host, but the other co-host is Frank Abagnale. Frank Abagnale was the well-known guy who was convicted and played by Leonardo DiCaprio in Catch Me If You Can. And Frank, they do all these amazing stories that don't necessarily apply to 50 and older people. They apply to anybody who, potential scams that are run out of, countries like Jamaica or Russia or China, and things that you need to be careful about. It's more like a, Norton or McAfee type show where you think about all the things you could be targeted with in scams. It's a really good show, and they weave in some music, and then barely occasionally they'll say, join us on ARP. I haven't listened to it in a while, but it's a really good show that I've listened to quite a lot, just because it's more of a true crime drama, but with a brand twist on it. But I talk about this a lot. I use this as an example I'd made up when talking about TV, is that in TV, a lot of people don't own their own proprietary property. And I made up this example that I think kind of, if you wrap your TV plus podcast brain around, you could come up with. If you think 10 years ago, nobody had really heard of Chip and Joanna Gaines. And Home Depot, for example, they could have grabbed two influencers who love to redesign homes and fix them up and sell them. And they could have posted that own content on their own show or on their own website. This is the same kind of thing you can do. You can create episodic type content in a podcast form and put it on your own website and draw people in. It doesn't always necessarily mean that you have to present that kind of stuff on HGTV or something like that. You've got to really start thinking about how creative as well you can be with your content, because initially that's what you're using to pull it in. So really then start thinking about what kind of topics should you produce. So I often use a lot of examples talking about sharks on my show, just because it's a side weird fanaticism for me. And I talk about thresher sharks in particular, which have a very long tail. So when you think of a long tail keyword and the discussion points, when you start looking at, social apps like Sprinkler and listening to what your customers talk about, you don't necessarily have to talk about everything your overarching brand does. And I'm going to give you an example, because I used to work for True Green Lawn Care. I drove the lead gen for their national, the national corporate office. One of the topics that people would often always just think about and talk about would be overseeding. You could develop a whole show series just around overseeding and be a niche topic that people are going to want to listen to on a regular to semi-regular business, how to do it, when to do it. But that's just one example. You could do it about any kind of show. It doesn't necessarily have to be how do you control weeds and, kill grub worms. And those two phrases are about the extent of my lawn care knowledge. But those kind of topics are what are the kind of things you could think about when niching the things that people want to talk about. So do podcasts have to be branded? This is a no. Podcasts can be a really impressive way to introduce your brand, but on the back end, you put your branding. It doesn't necessarily have to be brought to you by such and such. And I'm going to pull up an example. Bear with me, view notes. So nonfiction type content, this is an example. GE was the first one to do this. And Mike, can you see that screen? Where you see the message?
I could just see do podcast for brand.
Oh, okay, sorry, that's my fault.
The question.
I'm going to pull it back then. So forgive me.
You can unshare and then
share the other one.
Share that screen. Yep.
There we go. Why did I not see that right there? So forgive me. I'm starting to look like my grandmother trying to do this.
It's a lot to juggle.
Yeah. And hold the microphone, which I should have put on the stand before. So another example that I love to bring up often is the message. So GE did this several years ago. GE produced a podcast that was a fictional podcast. It was basically a way for them to tell a message, and then they wrapped some advertising around it front and back. Then another one that they produced was called Life After. But the one that really sort of received the most notoriety and probably the best example of how not to directly sell, but to create amazing content would be searching for Sell IE. This is one that two friends of mine, one of the guys that wrote Podcasts for Dummies, and also a friend of mine from SAP produced. And it was basically a story about the apprentice who worked for, said he worked for Leonardo da Vinci. He comes to the future and he meets a bunch of people and they debate whether or not he was the apprentice. Well, as it turns out, SAP was introducing a new product called Leonardo. So it was very brilliantly done that they were able to integrate that, still at the same time being able to tell a story. And there were ads softly done at the back. Now, SAP is a pretty successful company. They had amazing results out of this. So when you think about the kind of content that you can create that's really going to draw people in, as opposed to a heavy branded show, it really becomes an interesting question. What's your lead gen bait to bring people in? And they did an extremely great job with that show. But it's sort of a Mission Impossible challenge is the way I always think about it. But the people that you're trying to get to interview for a show, which is typically what people do, that becomes the big question. And I'm going to drop back to whether or not a podcast show has to be branded. What you also have to think about is, what is your authentic voice? If you cut the brand logo, let's say that you represent a brand or an agency, if you cut your brand logo out of it, are people going to recognize it? And that's what becomes very unfortunate, that so many shows, you could just simply insert your logo here. So for me, it's something as silly as sharks, MMA, and superheroes. And that's just silly stuff that I talk about on my show, that integrated in with a lot of marketing and advertising and lead gen, but they know that it's me. A lot of people don't do that, and it becomes sort of a quiet blend that looks like you're basically looking at the generic equivalent of Bayer aspirin versus a generic brand that people buy because it's cheaper and have no logo on it. So really focus a little bit, take some time to think about what is your different approach and how does it represent you. Another thing to think about is really starting to gate the kind of content that you put. I found that working with a lot of clients, that putting a podcast or an audio version of a blog post, for example, is a great way to gate some content on your different blog posts. So think of it this way, and you don't have to gate it. If you were going to gate it, I'd make it extremely soft gated, but it's looking at basically making sort of premium type content. Maybe you produce a blog post about a topic for your product or service, but if you offer something that becomes with a conversation with a high level expert, maybe a doctor within your organization or something like that, or somebody with, A-list expertise, you could gate that possibly as a download. I don't do that. I've only seen limited success, but I have seen it work with some people pretty substantially when they've gated it the correct way.